Hi, everybody. It only took about 30 minutes into my first University of Waterloo algebra class to know that I was in over my head. Now, I arrived at University of Waterloo thinking that I was the smartest person at my school, or one of them anyway. But when I arrived at the University of Waterloo and sat down in my first math class, I realized that I was in a room full of the people who were the smartest people in their school. So the professor started talking about the idea of a fourth dimension. And to try to make it easy for us to understand, he used a comparison to something we knew. He said the fourth dimension, think of a box. Now with the box, there are three dimensions that we know about: the length and the width and the height. But the fourth dimension, he said, was like the space inside of the box. Now, I have to confess that at the end of the day, that analogy didn't really help me. I still didn't really understand the fourth dimension or how to prove anything related to it, and my grades in all of my university algebra courses would attest to that fact. But I did appreciate the effort that the professor made to take something that I was struggling to understand and to compare it to something I could see and understand so that I could start to wrap my head around the concept he was trying to explain. Now, I share that story because it's relevant to what I want to preach about this summer. See, Jesus often taught in parables or using analogies, and part of this was to make it so that people had to want to understand, to put some effort into hearing what Jesus was saying. The word that Jesus often uses to say that he presented them with a parable is actually a word that is often used for presenting people with food at the table. And so the analogy there is that Jesus wants us to dig into these parables to really consume what was there in order to fully experience and understand what he was saying. But another part of this was that he was simply trying to highlight the characteristics of something that listeners didn't know by illustrating it with the characteristics of something the listeners did know. There are dozens of examples in particular of Jesus starting a teaching with the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven is like. In fact, there are 7 such instances in Matthew chapter 13 alone, as well as a parable where the kingdom language doesn't appear in the parable itself, but does appear in Jesus' explanation of it to the disciples. And so in doing this, Jesus was trying to help listeners understand what the kingdom of heaven or God was like. A kingdom that had already been announced as coming near, literally that it was at hand or drawing near or approaching, in Mark and Matthew at the time of Jesus' arrival and baptism. And it's important to understand that whatever Jesus was describing about the kingdom of heaven, what it definitely wasn't is a description of a physical space or location. But rather, it was a description of how God was working out his sovereign power and purpose in the world through the life of Jesus, and a description of his often unexpected motives and methods. So over the next number of weeks, I want to dive into some of the things Jesus said about the kingdom and see what we might learn about how that can and should impact us as disciples now. Reading from Matthew chapter 13, some selected verses. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got a boat and sat there, while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. And other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. That is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, but such a person has no root. They endure only for a while, and when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slaves said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow until harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, the field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen. See, in these first two parables of the kingdom from Matthew chapter 13, the comparator that Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like is based on images from the agricultural world. Now, I want to point out that for me, agricultural analogies might not always land. I grew up in the city, and my knowledge of farming is basically consisting of driving by a crop and perhaps knowing what's planted in that field, or perhaps not. Or driving by and mooing at the cows and buying at the sheep and neighing at the horses as we go past the farm. But in the culture of first century Palestine, the society was significantly agrarian, meaning agriculture was both a significant industry and a significant means of putting food on individual tables. Most people had at least some exposure to the ins and outs of agriculture, and for many they had in-depth knowledge. So while the kingdom of heaven may be an abstract and difficult to pin down concept, for Jesus' listeners, the language of agriculture would have been a comfortable language from which they could operate and understand. Everyone had at least some idea about the challenges and joys of sowing seed, and everyone had at least some understanding of the different types of soil one could attempt to grow on in Palestine. And everyone had at least some idea about the garden that had both good crop and weeds growing side by side. And so Jesus' choice in the parables that he told were intentional in giving listeners an access point from which they could understand what he was saying, if they chose to engage the hard work of listening. Now, these first two parables of Matthew 13 are familiar to us. We probably heard many sermons on them, but I don't want to focus so much on a line-by-line interpretation of the parable today, but instead I want to focus on what the parable is telling us about what the kingdom is like. While the first parable, what we would call the parable of the sower, isn't introduced with the construction the kingdom of heaven is like, it uses kingdom language in the explanations that Jesus makes that follows. And despite the title, the main focus of this parable isn't really on the sower, and in a lot of ways it's not even really on the seed, but rather the focus, the thing that differs and that makes a point in the story, is the soils. The worn footpath, the rocky ground, the thorny soil, and the good soil are key to understanding what Jesus is saying the kingdom is like. Now recall, the chapters leading up to this chapter had seen Jesus bringing his message of the kingdom to many settings and also receiving many varied reactions. He had big crowds, this passage tells us, that were following him and that were hanging on his every word. He had ruffled the authorities' feathers, and they were sort of questioning him and starting to build some hostility towards him. His family, worried for his safety and thinking that he'd lost his mind, had come over to take charge of him, the Gospel of Matthew says, to correct him and to protect him. And as we take into account the context and the story as a whole, the characteristic of the kingdom being highlighted here seems to be one about both access and separation. Access in that all have the ability to receive the same message of the kingdom from the same source, and thus access to the kingdom demonstrated in the fact that the parable involves one consistent sower and one uniform seed. And so part of the message here about what the kingdom of heaven is like is that the kingdom of heaven is for everyone. Anyone who hears the message of Jesus and responds has access to the kingdom of heaven. This is a message which ran contrary to the way the religious authorities at the time thought, and much of Jewish thought at the time. The idea that Gentiles or Romans or other races or people or creeds could possibly be accepted into the people of God, into the kingdom of heaven, ran contrary to almost everything that they thought and believed, and that their identity had been as the people of God. Which means that access to the kingdom isn't based on the message, but the response to the message that Jesus gives. And that response is represented by these four soils. The responses are seen to be able to vary, in fact, in the same way that responses to Jesus and his ministry and teaching had varied, according to the receptiveness that the receiver had towards the message. Now, some people, like the worn footpath, would simply not be open to receiving the kingdom. The words would bounce off them and bounce back to the giver, because they were not interested in engaging them or hearing them or listening to them or wrestling with them. They would simply get snatched away like a bird picking up seed, and nothing would come of it. Others would initially receive the message of the kingdom, but would not root themselves enough in the practices and the study of the scriptures and in living their life for God, and so they would eventually, despite initial growth, wither away. And still others would receive the kingdom, but would be choked out by other messaging and other priorities in the culture around them, and as a result, would not bear any fruit, even though they continued to grow. And to those who would receive, like the good soil, the message of the kingdom would grow in them, and the fruit that is that kingdom would be evident through and around them in their lives. Now, from the explanation of this parable, Jesus moves directly into another agricultural parable, and this time he's introducing it with the familiar construction, the kingdom of heaven is like. And literally, the word here for kingdom implies not just a territory that's subject to the rule of a king, but the right or authority to rule over a territory or a people. And the literal translation for the word written as like would be may be compared to. And so it might be helpful to think of this expression not as a description of a physical place like we mentioned before, but to how the parable compares to a territory where God reigns. In this case, the place where God reigns is compared to a field where a farmer has planted wheat. But during the night, an enemy had snuck in and had planted darnel in amongst the wheat. Now, this was a not infrequent thing that happened when neighbors were warring at the time of Jesus. In fact, there were specific Roman laws about what happens to you if you were to plant weeds in somebody else's field. Now, the particular problem with darnel, in addition to it being poisonous if consumed, is that until it gets to the fruit-bearing stage, till the grain head starts to grow, you can't tell the difference between wheat and darnel. And by the time you could, the roots were entwined with all of the wheat, and it was impossible to pull one plant out without damaging the other. Not separating darnel from wheat immediately ruins the entire harvest. And so again, we're not focusing on a full interpretation of the parable, but on what it says the kingdom is like. And I'd make a couple observations here about what this parable says the kingdom is like. First, although it certainly does deal with, especially in the explanation from Jesus in verse 30, starting in verse 36, It deals with what happens at the end of the age, but the focus of the parable in its dialogue is actually on the fact that the wheat and darnel were allowed to grow together, despite the landowner's slaves assuming that they should remove the darnel immediately, with the reason being that the farmer feared damaging the wheat by immediate removal of the darnel. In other words, the wheat and darnel, the kingdom of heaven and the children of the enemy, allowed to grow side by side until harvest time. It exists and is growing and bearing fruit right now, even in a world filled with darnel. But secondly, it shows the patience that God has, and thus we should have, in waiting for the harvest. Because of the existence of darnel, annoying as it is, because the existence of darnel, as annoying as it is, cannot stop the kingdom of heaven from bearing its fruit, and cannot stop the harvest from coming. See, the point I'm trying to make this week in the description of what the kingdom is like is really twofold. We may slip into, because of the language of heaven used here, we may slip into thinking that when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, it's a reference to what eternity will look like. It's telling us what our experience of whatever we consider heaven to be and wherever we consider it to be will look like and will feel. But really what Jesus is doing is making a reference to how God's reign is being established on earth now, and not about what things will look like in eternity. And second, it teaches us that our response to what Jesus teaches in rootedness and fruitedness is the mark of where the kingdom of heaven exists. Notice that when the farmer got to its harvest, what it talked about was removing the weeds, the darnel, from the kingdom of the children of God, from the kingdom of heaven. The children of the kingdom of heaven didn't move and go to the barn. The wheat wasn't taken to the barn first. The first thing that happened was the stain of sin, the darnel, was removed from the world around us, which means that we live in and under the kingdom of heaven now, in this time, by responding to Jesus' teaching and by living in a way that bears the fruit of the kingdom. And so as we go through this, my hope and my prayer is that we can continue to consider what it means to live a life that helps to institute the reign of God on this earth now, so that we can experience things on earth as they are in heaven.